Growing up, my family had a farm, and I would go there and I would work there, and my hero was my Uncle Aubrey, which is ironic because we're quite different people today. He has a grade 8 education. I have a PhD. He's lived in the same house, the same room since he was born over 85 years ago. I've moved all over the world and traveled and seen lots of different things. There couldn't be two people farther apart. I think that what appealed to me when I was a boy was his pastoral power. One of my jobs was to help the sheep move from the field into the barn. And I, to be honest, wasn't very good at it at the start. My Uncle Aubrey, though, he would come to the gate and he would stand there, and the sheep, no matter where they were in the field, would come running and into the barn. They knew who their shepherd was. I've used that image in a number of sermons and inductions and ordinations and those sorts of things, because it always struck me that my Uncle Aubrey was a vision of a pastor, of a shepherd. The problem is, when I read Foucault and Andy Root and his book Pastor in a Secular Age, it makes me wonder whether or not I actually understood what pastoral power was about. Is it possible that even though my Uncle Aubrey looks like a pastor and looks like a shepherd, looks like somebody who would be comfortable in Psalm 23, whether or not I've misunderstood it, and whether or not the power that we yield is different in the secular age? Today's video focuses on the bridge between part 1 and part 2 of Andy's book, in which he talks about Foucault and about Foucault's idea of pastoral power. I introduced this segment by talking about my Uncle Aubrey, who is a farmer. And the challenge that I've found in reading this is that we might have a conception of farmer or shepherd in our mind, but it doesn't necessarily conform to the reality of what it was to be a shepherd in the Old Testament times. So, for instance, the first thing that Foucault will talk about will be that shepherds are on the move. Flocks move from one place to another place, as compared to kings who try to take over territory. Now, this is nice, except in the West, we have pastors who have fields. There are fences around those, and they're, in fact, quite stable and quite territorial. That long-lasting tending to a place is the sign of the pastor, not on the move as the sign of the pastor. Second one that Foucault talks about are that it benefits the people and it's not about self-aggrandizement, which sounds good, except the farmer or the shepherd is the one that can always tell you the yield of the crop. They're not growing this for the benefit of the crop. They're growing it so that they can be able to have something to eat and even more to be able to sell it. Very few farmers in the West are subsistence farmers, looking after themselves off of the land. So there is some case that self-aggrandizement is part of being a farmer or pastor in today's world. The third case that, or the third category that Foucault talks about is the care for individuals and not doing a cost-benefit analysis. Of course, the family farm that I grew up with is going away because it's too competitive. There are large industrial-sized farms where there are thousands of cows milking instead of the dozens or hundreds that my family might have. The move away from small-scale local agriculture to industrial farming says that maybe our image of the farmer isn't so accurate after all. Upon reflection about my own understanding of pastor and shepherd based on my own experiences, and then comparing that to what Foucault was describing, I can see that even when I thought that I was talking about a pastor or a shepherd in the image of my uncle, I was really talking about a king, somebody who has a territory, somebody who is doing something for their own benefit, and that there is some sense in which there's a cost-benefit analysis that's going on. It's likely less than some others, maybe business literature around leadership or pastors, but it's still not approaching exactly the way that Foucault is describing it. And it makes me wonder about the sense of power that we have and where it comes from. How can we understand that? And is it desirable for us to try to recapture this image of a pastoral God? Earlier in our time together, I said that we would have a chance to ask Andy some questions. And I sent him a question that had to do with the difference between history and genealogy. It arose from somebody in our group who was reading along and noticed that there were historical inaccuracies. And they didn't necessarily think that they affected the outcome, but they were wondering, how does history and genealogy fit together? Andy has some thoughts about that.
Hello, Blair's Reading Group. Nice to talk to you, and I look forward to talking to you at the end of June here in a few weeks. So Blair's passed on a couple questions. I think I understand them, but if I don't answer them correctly, let's you and I just decide that we'll blame Blair. So this will all be Blair's fault, no matter what. If the answers aren't adequate, they'll be Blair's fault. So there we go. It's very probably un-Canadian to just pass the blame off on Blair and not to accept the need for apology myself. But there you go. I'm gonna do that on this morning. So the two. Yeah, this is a difficult thing of the book, and to be quite honest, I had a lot of unease about writing part one of the book because I really did want to use figures to make a lot of Taylor's concepts come to life, and Taylor kind of got into my head as well as he uses this kind of historical genealogy, and so there is a real difference between genealogy and history. I once had an occasion to sit with Charles Taylor at a cafe in Montreal, and I asked him what historians think of his book A Secular Age, and he said in a very humble way, he said, "I don't ask them." So there is something to that where if you were doing a historical analysis, it would have different necessities to hold to original documents, to check those documents, things like that. Taylor's impacted, and to be quite honest, I am too, by the Oxford professor Isaiah Berlin, who had this kind of transition from being an analytical philosopher to doing what he called the philosophical cultural history of ideas. And so what Berlin does in the early 20th century is look at different thinkers and different kind of historical moments for how they give us the DNA of our own imagination. And so what I'm trying to lay out here with these pastors is in no way kind of saying they are the normative or best pastors, but I am trying to say that these are the kind of pastors who, for good and even more times for ill, uh, their their kind of operation as pastor gets pressed into the kind of soft clay of our own imagination of what it means to be pastor. So this becomes kind of in our DNA. So, and this isn't all good. Like some of your own DNA means that you are more prone towards heart disease or whatever, but it doesn't, it impacts you at the core of who you are almost in an unthought way. Like you don't think about it until your doctor tells you this. But it will direct your life in a certain way. And so that's kind of what I'm getting at. I mean,
David was a shepherd, but he was also a king. And in 2 Samuel 7, it starts with these words. Now when the king was settled in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all of his enemies around him, the king said to the prophet Nathan, "See, now I am living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God stays in a tent." David recognizes that there's this contrast. He, the king, is in a house, but God is in the tent where he was. He was a shepherd, but now he's here. But God, in most nations, would be in the house, not in the field. David is this important transition figure. He moves from shepherd to king. And both of those are God-ordained positions for him. It means in some ways, doesn't it, that power, whether it's pastoral or kingly, can be of God. Is there a question about how we should exert that power and the ways in which we look after the congregations and the people who are around us? I'm sure. But what exactly those are in the secular age, we'll have to leave for another time.